It was one of those unusually warm spring mornings when I decided to check my mailbox. The kind of mundane task I had performed countless times before without incident, simply to collect a few letters and packages that had arrived over the weekend. Yet on this particular day, what should have been an ordinary, routine chore turned into one of the most surreal and frustrating encounters I have ever experienced, all because a neighbor, whose sense of entitlement far exceeded any reasonable expectation, decided that my taking a few extra seconds to look into my own mailbox was worthy of a 911 call. I had just stepped outside, enjoying the gentle warmth of the sun on my face, and strolled over to the curb where my mailbox stood, a small metal box on a post that had been part of the neighborhood for decades, containing the letters, bills, and occasional package that marked the rhythm of everyday life. I knelt slightly and opened it carefully, sifting through the mail to find a few priority envelopes while making sure not to damage anything, because some of the letters were from official sources and others were personal, all of which required a moment of attention. Yet it seemed that my deliberate pace and careful handling of my own property would soon be misinterpreted as something far more sinister by a particular resident whose gaze I had failed to notice until it was too late. From across the street, I noticed her a woman of the kind that seems to exist solely to create tension, where none is necessary. A middle-aged neighbor I had exchanged polite nods with only a few times in the past, but whose expression carried an unmistakable combination of suspicion and outrage, as if she had been waiting her entire life for someone to give her a reason to object to my presence. She had a smartphone in her hand, and before I could even comprehend what was unfolding, she raised her voice and began describing my activity to someone on the OD, her end, gesturing dramatically toward me while I remained unaware at first, focused entirely on the contents of my mailbox, utterly oblivious to the brewing storm across the street. I continued examining my mail, carefully removing envelopes and small packages, making sure I hadn't missed anything, and only then noticed a sudden shift in the neighborhood dynamic. A few neighbors had paused their morning routines watering lawns, taking out trash, walking dogs, and were now watching the escalating tension, whispers of confusion spreading quietly like ripples in water, as the woman gesticulated wildly and, in a voice that carried across the street, insisted that my activity was suspicious, threatening, and entirely unacceptable. I froze for a moment, trying to understand what had prompted such extreme behavior, and then I realized, with a combination of disbelief and irritation, that she had called the police, reporting that I was lingering too long in my own mailbox and suggesting that I might be engaged in something illicit, an accusation so absurd that it took me several seconds to fully process. The mere act of looking carefully into my own mailbox, a task millions of people perform daily, without incident, was now being presented as a potential threat, requiring law enforcement intervention. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens signaled the approach of a police vehicle, and I slowly closed my mailbox, stepping back with my hands visible and empty, hoping to demonstrate that I was completely harmless. But the woman, clearly emboldened by the act of making the call, continued gesturing toward me, narrating her version of events in a loud, authoritative tone, painting a picture of danger that existed entirely within her imagination. I tried to ignore the performance, reminding myself that she had no evidence beyond her own biased perception. But the situation had already drawn the attention of a handful of neighbors who were now watching intently from their porches and driveways, some shaking their heads, others whispering quietly about the sheer absurdity of the complaint. By the time the officer arrived, she was pacing slightly, phone still in hand, clearly expecting immediate action, while I stood calmly on the sidewalk, ready to explain the obvious truth, that I was a resident of the street, that the mailbox in question belonged to me, and that my only intention was to retrieve and sort through my own mail, a fact so straightforward that I assumed it would quickly resolve the confrontation. The officer approached, first listening to the woman's impassioned and increasingly exaggerated account of events, her gesture sweeping toward me, her voice rising and falling as she attempted to communicate the urgency of a situation that, in reality, did not exist. When it was finally my turn to speak, I politely explained that I lived in the house directly adjacent to the mailbox, that I had been carefully retrieving my mail, and that no unusual activity was occurring beyond the normal handling of correspondence. I emphasized that I had done nothing threatening, suspicious, or illegal, and that the amount of time I spent ensuring I hadn't missed anything was entirely reasonable given that some of the mail required attention to detail. The officer, listening carefully, glanced between the two of us, assessing the situation with calm professionalism, and it became immediately clear that the narrative offered by the woman across the street was wildly disproportionate to the actual events. Despite her insistence that my lingering at the mailbox posed a danger, the officer explained patiently that checking one's own mailbox is a completely lawful activity, and that a 911 call should be reserved for genuine emergencies, not instances of perceived inconvenience or discomfort caused by lawful behavior. He further noted that calling law enforcement over such trivial matters can waste valuable resources and even be considered an abuse of emergency services if done repeatedly. The woman's face, once filled with confidence and righteous indignation, slowly transformed into a mixture of shock, frustration, and embarrassment as she realized that her version of events was not only unconvincing but entirely unnecessary. As the officer reiterated the reality of the situation, explaining that my actions were entirely lawful and that no further action would be taken, nearby neighbors began to return to their routines, some offering quiet nods or smiles in my direction, recognizing the absurdity of the situation and perhaps silently celebrating the vindication of rationality over overreaction. I thanked the officer for his professionalism, closed my mailbox completely, and stepped back onto the sidewalk, carefully putting my hands at my sides, ensuring that there was no possible misinterpretation of my intentions. And as I walked back toward my house, I reflected on the surreal encounter, marveling at how quickly an ordinary, mundane activity had been transformed into a spectacle worthy of police involvement simply because one individual allowed her personal irritation and sense of entitlement to escalate without restraint. By the time I returned indoors, I was a mixture of exhausted, amused, and incredulous, realizing that this incident would become one of those stories I would recount for years, as a testament to human overreaction, the extremes of entitlement, and the occasional comedy that emerges from everyday life when someone chooses to manufacture drama out of nothing. The experience reinforced a few important lessons: the value of remaining calm in the face of absurd accusations, the importance of allowing truth and reason to prevail over overblown narratives, and the reminder that sometimes even the simplest, most innocuous actions like taking a few extra seconds to look carefully into your own mailbox can provoke irrational responses from those determined to see conflict where none exists. Ultimately, the day ended much as it had begun, with me inside my home, mail sorted and accounted for, and a newfound appreciation for patience, perspective, and the resilience required to navigate a world in which ordinary activities can occasionally be mistaken for offense, intrusion, or threat, and in which the best course of action is often to remain composed, allow facts to speak for themselves, and let those who overreact reveal the absurdity of their own behavior. Because in the end, reality has a way of asserting itself even against the most dramatic and baseless claims.